How the torch from the Statue of Liberty was moved to a museum. It took 2 years of worry and strategizing, but the day of truth finally arrived for Doug Phelps. As part of a $100 million upgrade, his construction crew moved the original Statue of Liberty torch from its resting place inside the statue's pedestal, where it's been on display since it was replaced in the 1980s, and relocated it to a new museum nearby. Early Thursday morning, a crew of 15 moved the 3,600-pound torch, made of copper and amber glass, from one side of Liberty Island to the other. The obvious question: how were they going to do it? Very carefully, Phelps said. Some clever engineering was required, as designed by Frederick August Bartholdi and delivered to America in 1885. The torch is more than 16 feet tall and 12 feet across. The doors of the museum are not quite 8 feet high. The torch would need to be disassembled. In 1885, the torch was transported in crates by ship from France to what was then a military base known as Bedloes Island. It was made of solid copper sheets, and about a month before the public dedication of the statue in 1886, the U.S. Lighthouse Board cut 2 rows of staggered holes for electric lights inside the flame, but the light was scarcely visible from the harbor, and the results were disappointing. In the early days, the military opened the torch up to VIP visitors, who would climb a 40-foot ladder into it and gaze onto New York Harbor from its ornate balcony. "But you had to be pretty special to do that," said John Piltziker, superintendent of Liberty National Monument. In 1916, the flame was redesigned by Gutzon Borglum, the creator of Mount Rushmore, to accommodate windows. They were beautiful, but they weren't done properly, and every time it rained, the torch leaked. Then in July of that year, the Black Tom explosion, an extraordinary but mostly forgotten disaster, rocked the harbor when saboteurs destroyed a munitions plant across the water in Jersey City, New Jersey. The explosion destroyed the depot, breaking windows as far away as Manhattan and sending debris flying into the statue. The Statue of Liberty remained standing, but the torch was weakened, which gave the military an excuse to put a stop to the visits. It was closed and never reopened, except to maintenance workers. "I can't tell you how many people have said to me, 'I've been up to the torch,'" said Stephen A. Briganti, president and chief executive of the Statue of Liberty Ellis Island Foundation. "I say, no, you probably haven't, unless you're really old." Apparently, people confuse it with trips they've taken to the Crown, which is still open today, or maybe they've seen Alfred Hitchcock's 1942 film Saboteur 1 too many times, which features a dramatic but fictional standoff in the torch. Even without visitors, the torch fell into disrepair over the years, and in the 1980s, the Liberty Island Foundation was formed to raise money to restore the statue and replace the torch for its centennial celebration. The island was closed, the statue surrounded by the largest scaffolding ever constructed up until that point, and the torch gently lowered by crane. On July 4, 1984, with about 1,000 people sitting out there, and some of us very nervous this thing would just fall on the floor, it was lowered, Briganti said. A new torch, without windows and gilded in gold, part of Bartholdi's original, unexecuted plan, was subsequently placed in Lady Liberty's hand. The old torch went on a tour of the country. It led the Rose Bowl parade in 1985. On its return to New York, it was moved into the statue's pedestal after a trough was dug and the grade lowered. Since the torch was too big to fit through the elaborate bronze doors, a museum was built around the torch on the second floor of the structure. But with the number of visitors to the island growing every year, currently around 4 million, a new museum at a different site on the island is scheduled to open in May 2019. The original torch will be its centerpiece. This time around, the Park Service didn't want to close the island to move the torch. There are up to 25,000 visitors on the busiest days, so Phelps and his team came up with the plan to keep everyone happy. Over the past 2 weeks, from the park's 4 p.m. closing until 2 a.m., workers built several temporary rooms to store equipment and tools. Then, using a small spider crane that can fit inside the building, the team took the torch apart in 2 pieces, one consisting of the flame and tube that holds it, the other the base and balcony. A cradle made of foam, nylon straps and other soft materials was wrapped around each piece. The night before the move, after all the tourists had left the island, the flame was hoisted outside by crane. The base, far too wide to fit upright through the doors, was turned.
Howdy how, folks. Tommy back here with another video for you. And this one is going to be on Black Tom. Matter of fact, this video and maybe the next video even too, because there is a lot of info out there. And now there is a backstory on why we never heard of Black Tom in the first place. And so you'll be learning that if you haven't already in this video or the next. So this here is just going to be a radio talk show clip. A guy named Chad Millman, who works for ESPN, is an expert on Black Tom apparently. Go figure. Anyway, so he wrote a book called The Detonators, a nearly forgotten New York attack. I'm pretty sure that's the name of the book. Or, yeah, okay, yeah, The Detonators, yeah. So anyway, let me play that for you. Hopefully I don't run out of memory on this stupid phone before it gets over with. So here we go.
And today, a look back at a day in history, a day when saboteurs attacked the city of New York, 9/11. This incident happened 90 years ago, July 30th, 1916. The perpetrators didn't use a plane or fly into a building. They blew up an ammunitions depot on a tiny slip of land called Black Tom Island in New York Harbor. The blast essentially destroyed the island. The explosion is said to have been so powerful it was felt as far away as Maryland. It blew out windows from Jersey City to Midtown Manhattan and Brooklyn. Much of lower Manhattan was destroyed, yet very few know anything about it today. Chad Millman is senior editor at ESPN, the magazine, and author of The Detonators, The Secret Plot to Destroy America and an Epic Hunt for Justice. He joins us now from our bureau in New York. Nice to have you on Talk to the Nation.
Thanks for having me.
So what happened on that warm July day 90 years ago?
Well, the German saboteurs, as you would say, they sort of congregated on Black Tom Island with small timing devices that were set to explode, and they planted them all over the rail yard where all these ships were loaded with different munitions, dynamite, bullets, etc., that were going to the front. They were going to the British and the French in Europe for World War I. They were not going to the Germans. The Germans could not afford the munitions. The American companies were selling the munitions to the British and the French. So the only way the Germans knew of to stem the tide of munitions going overseas was to blow up Black Tom Island, which was then the largest munitions depot in the country.
And the United States was at that point neutral in what was called at the time the Great War, and as you said, offered to sell to anybody, including the Germans. There was also a British naval blockade that prevented German ships from bringing those supplies in.
Exactly. That was actually the main problem. Is the Germans saw Black Tom as a symbol both of commerce and of American hypocrisy, because Woodrow Wilson had declared that the U.S. was neutral, yet he was allowing American companies to sell their munitions to the British and the French. And that's what was killing the Germans, and it was beating them back on the front lines. Even though it was only meters at a time, it was still sort of depleting their resources. So it was a target, and it made them angry, and there were so many intern German sailors here in the United States that it was a natural spy network for Germany to tap into when they wanted to wreak havoc.
We're talking with Chad Millman, author of The Detonators, The Secret Plot to Destroy America and an Epic Hunt for Justice. You're listening to Talk of the Nation from NPR News. Two questions. The Germans took an awful risk. If this was discovered, certainly the United States might have been impelled to join the Allies and fight against Germany right then and there.
Well, absolutely. But the Germans had been taking a lot of risks almost as soon as the war began. They had a phony passport operation that had been discovered by the New York City police and that Woodrow Wilson knew about. They had their commercial attaché his briefcase had been lost in a subway, and the contents were reported back to the government, and that showed checks being used to buy munitions, to blow up munitions depots all over the country. So they knew they were taking a risk, but they also knew that Wilson was bending over backwards to make sure that he did not have to go to war. He was going to campaign in 1960, and he did campaign as the man who kept us out of war, and it was, you know, his moral and political obligation, he felt, to keep the U.S. out of war, at least until after he was reelected, in which case he, you know, the U.S. went to war, you know, within 8 months of him being reelected. So it was a political calculation on the part of the Germans, because they had the feeling that Wilson was going to make sure that the U.S. didn't go into war until he absolutely positively had to.
Well, also that was after the Zimmerman note, the purported German alliance with Mexico. Well, anyway, a long story. Getting back to Black Tom Island, the investigation, though, didn't uncover the fact that this was indeed an act of sabotage. They thought it was an accident.
Yeah, I mean, that was also part of you know, there's intimations there that there was a cover-up, because the first thing that the New York Times wrote the day after the explosion was this would be cause for celebration in both Berlin and Vienna, that all these munitions were destroyed and their soldiers would no longer be killed by them. But if not for the explanation from the chief of the Bureau of Investigation, who said that this was not an act of sabotage, this was an accident. You have to remember that at the time, all the newspapers were insinuating that there were German saboteurs throughout the United States, you know, wreaking destruction all over the country.
Sure.
And so there was a tide changing towards and a lot of animosity towards the Germans at the time. So that was the first instinct of a lot of people, and certainly the newspapers, and that's why the government immediately tried to downplay that scenario.
Yeah, there was, remember, the victory cabbage as opposed to sauerkraut. So anyway,
Yes, exactly.
there was a long, long investigation, as you call this epic hunt for justice, after the war. The Germans didn't admit that, in fact, this was an attack.
Well, you know, it's funny that there was a commission that was set up to handle all the damages done both in Germany and the United States, and each government was required to pay back for that damage. This was of 12,000 cases, this was the only case that Germany would not settle. The Weimar government was basically concerned that if they were to settle this case, it would look like it was tantamount to them starting the war with the United States. And for morale and political reasons in their own country, they couldn't afford to do that. They needed to come out looking as victorious as possible, and they couldn't afford to look like they had started the war with the United States. And on the flip side, the U.S. wasn't all that interested in trying to blame Germany for this. The U.S. government, while they had set up this commission and were funding the lawyers who fought this case and investigated this case, they wanted Germany as an economic partner. They didn't want to take all of Germany's money when they were trying to rebuild their government or rebuild their infrastructure.
Your book describes the long, complicated process by which, at the very last minute, in fact, some justice was achieved and a settlement was agreed upon finally. But I wanted you to talk about sort of an ominous aftershock to that explosion on Black Tom Island 90 years ago.
Well, there were a lot of ominous aftershocks. I mean, one of the main instances of Black Tom sort of spinning forward was FDR was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy during World War I, and he was well aware of German sabotage within the United States. And one of the main attorneys on the case, John McCloy, he's the one who ultimately solved the case and was able to prove Germany's guilt. He became the Assistant Secretary of War during World War II for Roosevelt, mainly because of his expertise in German policies. And after Pearl Harbor, FDR was sitting in the Oval Office and they were discussing internment. McCloy was there. And FDR ultimately decided to intern the Japanese. And he looked at McCloy and he winked and said, "We don't want another Black Tom." So the fear of what Black Tom had caused was palpable even 30 years later in the Oval Office following Pearl Harbor.
The example, whether it was accurate or not, there was a large group of German Americans in that case fearful that Japanese Americans might do the same thing.
Yes, exactly. The fears have never gone away.
Chad Millman, thanks very much. Good luck with the book.
Thank you very much.
How folks, Tommy here with some more Black Tom information. And in this one, this lady's going to be talking about Black Tom and how how Woodrow Wilson suppressed it or covered it up, and why he did that. And that becomes the reason why we never heard of Black Tom. Apparently, this is the backstory. And I've got one video already that I just made on that. This is a continuation of the backstory. Here we go. If I can get it ready. Hang on, bear with me.
Yes, Wilson ran on a platform of he kept us out of war. Now, in July of 1916, there was a tremendous explosion in New York Harbor at what was called Black Tom's Island. And after the war, the court ruled that the German agents had, in fact, caused the explosion. And in the 1970s, the German government finally paid the United States an indemnity. Now, I was wondering if you could comment on the role of the Wilson administration in covering up that explosion and its effect on the election. And I'll hang up and listen on the TV.
Well, that was a massive explosion of the ship, which it actually damaged part of the Statue of Liberty, shattered windows as far north as 42nd Street. The Wilson administration did downplay this because it...
I said woman, but I thought it was that lady that was going to talk. My bad. It's this guy here, David, whatever. I can't pronounce his last name. But here we go.
The Wilson administration did downplay this because it was trying to keep us out of the war at this point. Now, it was very difficult for Hughes that year because he's fighting two things. The country is very prosperous. There was a slight downturn after the adoption of the Underwood Tariff. But with the war, neutral parties tend to do very well in wartime. So there's a great prosperity. So he's fighting that. And he's also fighting the fact that we really are at peace. The troubles which had occurred after the sinking of the Lusitania are the German government comes to its senses momentarily and ends its policy of unrestricted submarine warfare. It's not until after the election that it resumes that. There is tremendous sabotage going on in the country. There's funding of pro-German groups. One of the problems that Wilson has during the war, during the election, is they bring up pro-German groups. One of the problems that Wilson has during the war, during the election, is they bring up a meeting which he had with 4 pro-German people, one of whom was a fellow named Jeremiah O'Leary, an Irish nationalist. This was one of the big issues, too, regarding the 1916 campaign, which is that why there would be anti-English sentiment would be among the Irish population. And the Irish, it wasn't just 400 years of ill feelings, it was that they were still under the British flag at that part. They wanted their independence. So Hughes is facing all of these problems, and the question is what's he going to do about them? And the troubles arise after that election, particularly in regard to the Zimmermann note, which is unveiled where Germany is plotting, we're trying to entice Mexico into attacking us and taking, their lost provinces back.
Before we leave this section on Hughes' personal life, I'd like to talk about his spouse, Antoinette Carter. Can you tell us a little bit more about how they met?
All right, so that was that, and then there's this here. Apparently the same guy, but he's older.
Heard of the Black Tom explosion? There was Black Tom Island out of the coast of Germany, and it blows sky high with munitions, okay? And it shutters the Statue of Liberty. It wrecks part of that. And they try to blow up the Welland Canal in Canada, and eventually he is expelled from the United States of America.
That was weird.
Now, in July of 1916, a group of agents working for the German ministry actually conducted an attack, a terrorist attack in New York City, and they threw some explosives into the naval arsenal facility at Black Tom Island, and it created an earthquake under the city of New York. It actually caused damage to the Statue of Liberty. Now, just a few months later, after that attack, as the government was trying to figure out who actually conducted the attack, this U-boat showed up in Newport, Rhode Island, where we are today. The German submarine U-53, under the command of Lieutenant Hans Walser, pulled into the Narragansett Bay, pulled up to buoy number 2, right next door to the United States Naval War College, and the skipper of the U-53 got on board a water taxi and got his way up to Dewey Field and walked up the hill to Dewey Field and went to the main building of the Naval War College at Dewey Field and went to the main building of the Naval War College at Luce Hall. He knocked on the front door and he said, "Hi, my name is Hans Walser, and I'm here to send a postcard." And the person at the quarterdeck said, "Well, okay, what else are you here for?" And Rosa said, I'm here to call upon the president of the Naval War College. And at the time, that was Admiral Austin Knight. And so they walked up the stairs to the second floor of Luce Hall, and Lieutenant Hans Walser of the Imperial German Navy introduced himself to Admiral Knight, the president of the Naval War College. And Admiral Knight said, "Why are you here? We're neutral. You are a warship, and you are in danger of violating the neutrality laws, at which time we'll have to place you in internment." And Hans Walser said, No, it's okay. I'm just here to mail a postcard to my mother and to call upon you as is appropriate in naval tradition.
That's crazy, too. And we know this guy, Oliver North.
Saboteurs landed here, right here, on this beach in eastern Long Island. Their mission? To strike at the heart of America with acts of sabotage. And just like the terrorists from 9/11, they had all lived in America, and they all knew our country well. This is the story of the men who invaded our country, and those who stopped them.
The Germans had threatened the United States long before 1942. In 1916, while World War I was raging in Europe, Americans felt safe. Imperial Germany was waging an all-out war against Britain and France, but the fighting was taking place more than 3,000 miles away across the Atlantic Ocean. Americans were more concerned about baseball. Although President Woodrow Wilson had officially declared the United States neutral in the conflict, we were supplying the British and French with munitions, and the Germans knew it. Using a Manhattan brownstone as a headquarters, several German spies organized an attack against America. At 2:08 a.m. on July 29, 1916, an enormous explosion occurred near the Statue of Liberty at a place then called Black Tom Island.
Black Tom was an ammunition depot off the coast of New Jersey in New York Harbor, and it had an extraordinary amount of explosives.
Richard Powers is a history professor at City University of New York and the author of Secrecy and Power, The Life of J. Edgar Hoover.
This was detonated with one of the most remarkable explosions in New York City until the World Trade Center bombings. Shattering windows in New Jersey, Manhattan, over in Brooklyn.
The dark cloud of sabotage rose above the United States. Though still neutral, America was becoming painfully aware of the enemy within. And everywhere the words Black Tom were on an angry nation's lips.
Everywhere? I doubt it.
Words pointed to German sabotage.
The sabotage had been ordered by this man, German intelligence officer Franz von Papen, to stop U.S. arms shipments to Europe. Barely 12 months after Black Tom Island was attacked, the United States declared war on Germany. Then, like now, Homeland Security became imperative, And one government agency stepped up to the plate, the FBI.
Crooked FBI.
The G-Men. This is a Bureau of Scientific Crime Detection. New, modern, up to the minute. The FBI never
FBI so full.
never sleeps. The G-Men have become a legend. So what's the mystery behind their badge?
The predecessor to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, or the FBI, was the Bureau of Investigation. The name wasn't officially changed to the FBI until 1935.
The Bureau of Investigation started with approximately 33 special agents. It went through a number of periods of rapid growth.
Well, it turns out that one of the most potent symbols of American freedom began life as a Muslim woman. That's according to researchers who say that the Statue of Liberty was originally intended to represent an Egyptian peasant. The sculptor Frederic Auguste Bartholdi of France planned for his work to guard the entrance to the Suez Canal. But when he was unable to sell his idea to Egypt, Bartholdi journeyed to America with his drawings of a Muslim woman in Arab peasant garb and transformed her into a Roman goddess of liberty.
The year was 1885. The day, June 17th, when one of the greatest symbols of our nation's freedom, the Statue of Liberty, first sailed into the New York harbor. For almost 130 years, she has stood as a beacon, a sign of hope, and an enduring symbol of the American dream. She has welcomed countless immigrants, and millions come to see her every year. Safe to say, we all love her, and for the most part, we think we know her. But do we? Come on, let's go to Amy Holmes from Real News.
Hey, Raj.
How are
Welcome.
you?
Good to see you.
Now,
Lady Liberty, quite spectacular.
tell me about her.
She was a gift to the United States from France as a sign of international friendship and put in the New York harbor to welcome immigrants coming to our shores. At that time, back in 1876, when she was first sculpted, that meant a lot of Western Europeans who were coming across the Atlantic, and their first stop often was New York.
So who designed her, who built her? Tell me some of that kind of stuff.
Sure. So a Frenchman named Frederic Auguste Bartholdi designed the Statue of Liberty. And something that I read that was fascinating is her copper skin that he sculpted her out of is actually thinner than 2 pennies. So you look at the Statue of Liberty,
Really?
you think like it must be so heavy, which of course it is, but the actual material that he used is very supple copper that then turned brown and then became green because of the oxidation process. So she actually started out a different color. Isn't that funny?
I think that's an interesting thing because I always just assume that the Statue of Liberty, she's green.
No, she started out like a copper penny. So her outer shell, that thin membrane, that was sculpted by the Frenchman Bartholdi, but her inside structure was created by a Frenchman named Eiffel, and perhaps you know him from the Eiffel Tower. So how were they going to get this huge statue to stay up? Well, they went to Eiffel to engineer it and figure it out.
So how did it end up in New York?
Well, it was shipped across the Atlantic with the intention of being a gift of America's 100th birthday to celebrate July 4th, 1776, when we declared our independence. It got here a little late, about 10 years later, and was finally erected on Liberty Island in 1886. Now, coming across the ocean, it took 350 individual pieces packed in over 200 crates to get her from France to the United States. So you can understand why it took some time to get her up on that pedestal.
So aside from just the staggering size of the statue is the symbolism. The symbolism is cool. And it seems like almost every little nook and cranny has some sort of symbolism attached to it.
The sculptor was very thoughtful in all of the different elements that he chose. So of course there's the torch, which we're also familiar with, that is a symbol of liberty and light and enlightening the world. Then you have the Statue of Liberty's crown with 7 points on it. Those 7 rays of the sun are actually the 7 seas and the 7 continents of the whole world.
I did not know that.
I had no idea either. All of these little details, even down to the shoes that she's wearing.
Really?
Yes, so the Statue of Liberty is wearing sandals, and those sandals are a symbol of free people, sort of the common man wearing sandals, and around her feet are broken chains and shackles to represent, again, American freedom. And it's all over the statue that there are all these really neat symbols.
How, if at all, has she been altered since she was first put up?
So the first real reconstruction was in 1916 during World War I, and that's when some German saboteurs, they exploded munitions on an island near the statue, and it did damage to the statue, in particular the torch. So we had to go and repair the torch, but what's kind of interesting and maybe a little sad is the torch has been closed to anybody being able to go in it ever since. And then after the World Trade Center disaster in 2001, Lady Liberty was actually closed for 3 years. And I don't know if you remember, there was scaffolding all around. It was really interesting. So they were doing work on her just as recently as a little over 10 years ago.
So it's, I mean, it's kind of the story of America in this one little statue, because you've had World War I affected, the September 11th affected,
Sure,
Hurricane
storms,
Sandy
Hurricane
affected.
Sandy, exactly, and yet there she is, standing tall, standing proud, and enduring.
You see how she just wraps things up like that? Amy,
Thanks so much,
thank you
Raj.
so much.